You know, I did already kind of do this with the Carol vs. Bavarian Illuminati video, but I feel like a dedicated video to Carol is obviously in order, considering that she's one of my favorite characters in the entirety of Symphogear, only being tied with Maria. I didn't think she'd get so far up on my list, but remembering how I reacted back on my first watch when she returned in XV, as well as having Daredabla, the Annihilating Harp, within my top 5 songs of the series, I realized, yeah, Carol's kinda cool, which is why my second Gear video was basically a Carol video instead of it being the Unison video. So with us going over Symphogear in depth, and by in depth I mean completely obsessing over it, today we'll be talking about the leader of the alchemic cult, the murderer of miracles, Carol Malus Deinheim. This one will be a bit different in the way of presentation of the scaling, but it'll be a bit more in depth with the interpretations of Carol as a whole, so you were warned. Now with that being said, let's go out and destroy some miracles. After defeating the priestess that threatened to destroy the moon to release humanity from the curse of Balal, as well as a relic released by the FIS that threatened to destroy the planet after powering the frontier just by being near it, the Gears would face their strongest foes yet, being a little girl and her dolls. Carol Malus Deinheim is a formidable adversary, someone who, even though she is quite wanked by the community, no one can truly grasp the full potential of, even by the end of the series. An example would be when we first see her fight, as this is right off of the cuff of Kirika and Shirabe fighting against Mika and the Alkanoids, with the blades of Zababa having the power of Unison, allowing them an amp that puts them above every other Gear user as stated in the guides, only to fail and lose despite having full compatibility with Linker. Now granted, this was an autoscorer that was stated to be directly stylized for combat, as Carol would send her alongside Gotti to fight against the Gungnir duo after Amaria without Linker started to pressure an autoscorer by herself, but this doll is a piece in Carol's plan that was intended to only be used to draw out an increase in the Gear's power, despite the Gears already surpassing their previous versions that were already around the speed of light from scaling to Miku in the Shinshojin, while also surpassing the planetary threat of the Nephilim that destroyed the entire treasury of Babylon after absorbing the power of all of the Gears with vitalization. After the defeat of Zababa, Chris and Tsubasa would arrive with upgraded Gears, completely wiping out the Alkanoids that they had trouble with in base, forcing Carol to intervene and send Mika away. Carol would activate Daredabla, completely overwhelming these upgraded Gears with nothing but alchemy, with the rest of the group wondering exactly how Carol grew this powerful without the use of Phonic Gain, which Elf9 confirms as the incineration of her memories via transmuting electrical signals in the brain for power, stating that if Carol was using this power, she expected results from this fight. The two users alongside Hibiki would combat her with a new transformation, being the Ignite module, a power that puts them on par with Carol with a multiplier of around 10 times to all stats, only to completely overwhelm her after also utilizing Unison, which is another amp that's relative to Ignite's 10 times in the following arc when they learn to fight to compensate for said lack of Ignite. I know some people may have an issue with me saying that the Gears are using Unison here, since they didn't technically learn how to use it until AXZ, but this actually isn't the case, since Kirika and Shirabe are both constantly using Unison, giving us the confirmation that any duo or trio song where they're singing together is Unison. We do also get this confirmation in XV as well when Carol fights with the other Burning X Drive users, stating that it is a 7-way Unison, so just because it isn't directly stated doesn't mean that they are not using it. Now while this seems like more of a feat for the Gears, this would prove that Carol in this fight was holding back significantly, only doing as much as needed to push them to use Ignite for the first time. Despite Elf9 going on to say that Carol and the Autoscorers are people that they would need Project Ignite for, as they go over that a climax song, a 2 to 5 times multiplier in strength, wouldn't even be guaranteed to work, while X Drive, though powerful, is considered a miracle and wasn't something that they could completely rely on. After suffering rejections after a self-game end, Carol would come back in the final fight of the arc, only this time with a utilization of the power of Phonic Gain, which the users akin the power to a climax song. which, as I did advise before, was a 2 to 5 times multiplier in strength, as we note from the Maria and Tsubasa fight awakening the Nephilim back in the previous arc in G. Not only that, but Tsubasa even worries that Hibiki's S2CA wouldn't allow her to handle the strain of Carol's regular singing, which is only later confirmed to actually be weaker than her full-on singing when they utilize Ignite, which can get up to a 1000 times multiplier with the 3 different stages. As Chris would go on to say that she just gets stronger even though they unlocked 2 different Ignite stages. We would later get a confirmation of how strong Carol's phonic gain output is, being one of her most famous lines, stating that her phonic gain was the equivalent of 7 billion climax songs, making it around the 35 billion times amp in strength, which coincides with the activation of X-Drive during their fight with Hibiki's S2CA, as well as the previous arc allowing them to use X-Drive with the climax songs of the people on Earth, which is, as you guessed it, 7 billion. With this massive power differential between Carol and the users, the only way the group would be able to combat her would be by using the S2CA hexa conversion, using Argotlum to divert the phonic gain while Gungnir collected it, all to allow all 6 of the gears to activate X-Drive, despite Hibiki not being able to use the S2CA to convert Carol's phonic gain previously while releasing the limiters on all 3 of Ignite's stages. While this power increase puts them on the same level at Carol at first glance, Carol would still prove to be stronger than the gears, with her not only being able to block an attack from Maria and Tsubasa at once, but also transforming into the Alchemic Beast, a form so strong that it required 5 out of the 6 X-Drive gears to attack by funneling all of their energy through their armed gears of Striker, only to break the hull of the Alchemic Beast, and Carol saying that they were 1 armed gear too short, implying that even with 5 X-Drive level users, it still wouldn't be enough to take her out. Hibiki would later gather up the phonic gain from this attack, striking down Carol in a climactic final attack in the form of Glorious Break, causing Carol's Alchemic Beast form to self-destruct with a power that was compared to a miniature sun, as well as requiring Hibiki to use Ignite on top of X-Drive to save Carol, which we still end up seeing her being slightly injured by after the fight has occurred. However, this would all be a Carol that is significantly nerfed via rejection from self-game end, as even during the final clash she would be suffering from rejections that she was dealing with on her reincarnation into her new body. But all of this doesn't compare to Carol's rebirth in XV.
If that's the case, then what can I do for everyone?
Poor thing. But still, there's nothing else that you can do!
If that's the case, then
That's the form we all wanted to see. Another miracle at the very last second?
a miracle, you say? Don't make me laugh. I am the murderer of all miracles!
Throughout the previous arc where Carol is non-existent, we end up getting pretty crazy scaling, with the user surpassing the Alkanoids that create the pocket dimension with its own planets, stars, and nebulas, all in base, while also getting amps with Unison and Ignite on top of said base, only to receive an additional X-Drive level amp after rebuild to fight Adam, the leader of the Bavarian Illuminati and prototype of man that was stated to be too perfect by the Custodians, who, while holding himself back, was able to take energy from the entire constellation of Orion to open God's gates. This would not only be at the bare minimum of feat that puts him around solar system level while holding back, but this will also scale every gear to him when he gets much stronger and faster in Baphomet, with the feat of taking power from the stars putting it at around 80 million times faster than light. After this massive jump in strength, which is confirmed in the fight against the Coffin and the guide confirming that their gears got an equivalent amp after the Atom fight, the users would then start to get pressured by Noble Red, who take advantage of their lack of Ignite and trap them in Daedalus's Labyrinth, a philosophical armament whose internal distance is the same as the distance between the Earth and the Moon that also multiplies their power exponentially, going so far as to nearly defeat these users before they use Amalgam. However, upon Carol's rebirth, Carol shows a massive power differential compared to her previous fights with these users, as this recreation of Carol's memories via Elf 9 is able to fight against and overpower Noble Red, fighting against them twice, this within the same course of like maybe half an hour at most. I don't know, it's definitely not the whole night. Taking them on not just once, but also being able to destroy Daedalus's labyrinth and stop Daedalus' end, with Carol stating that all she needed to do to destroy it was sing, not using anything like a dying light or the alchemic beast, with this attack nearly killing the previous gear users before Amalgam and only being destroyed when Noble Red pushed the attack so much that they destroyed the labyrinth themselves. While Carol would exhaust herself, this would be after also going out of her way of giving 5 of the Symphogear users X Drive on top of her previous fight. Now, something that a lot of people kind of dismiss is a statement made by Vanessa, where she mentions that Carol is able to use multiple octaves of Aristotle, and while this does seem like just a throwaway line, this is crazy after taking into the account the fact that no other alchemist in the verse had been shown to perform any feat like this. Every other alchemist in the series has only been shown to use one element at a time, even Adam, though Carol will constantly be using every octave at once, which further solidifies the strength of her alchemy back in her first fight, being something that could have made her upwards of 100 times stronger without any of the phonic gain amps. On top of this, Genjiro also states that Carol, even in this smaller form, is still someone that they need a plan against, as Hibiki was out of commission, showing even further that this reborn Carol is still such a massive threat to these characters, despite being tens of thousands of times stronger than the last time they had fought Carol. After this fight, Carol will proceed to fight against Shemha, the custodian who bestowed so much power onto Noble Red that the gear users would need Amalgam and Unison to fight against, all aside from one person, with their amps still putting them below a base Shemha without the Shenshojing. During this fight, Carol wouldn't get the upper hand until she catches Shemha, binding her and nearly taking her out with Alcahest, an attack that was a miniature version of the world dissection that reduces everything to prima materia, the building block of the verse. And while this molecular dissection would almost work, Carol would only be pushed back from the Shenshojing and its evil banishing properties, with this victory basically being implied several times over by Carol's alchemy being stated to be close to taking down God or being a rival to God, and even Shemha acting like this would have been something that could take her down and praising Carol for being that strong, as she assumed that Carol would need a massive amount of energy to even activate Alcahest in the first place. After this fight and the advent of Burning X Drive, Carol would still show that she was on the level of these Burning X Drive users and potentially even above them, being able to break through Shemha's barrier and destroy part of the Shenshojing. And even with Shemha applying outer physics and silver transmutation, Carol would be able to overwrite that with golden transmutation while basically running on nothing after Shemha's Deus Ex Machina form was destroyed with Overbrave, which required all 6 gears on top of her to destroy. This is also something that is interesting to go over with her scaling, since this Carol that overpowers Shemha was a Carol that just used Alcahest a fight prior with no time to rest, meaning that this is something that Carol has the potential to just whip out multiple times had she not been trying to work with the other gears. Now, some will say if that's the case, then why didn't she do it again, but that's something that can easily be dismissed by the Shenshojing blocking it the first time, as the Shenshojing is stated to have evil banishing properties, meaning that it wouldn't make sense for Carol to try the same move that failed due to a specific reason again when she already knows what's going to happen. However, something else to mention is that this is a Carol who had fused in a body with Elf 9, who also had memories to burn, which she confirms when she asks why Carol hadn't used a single one of her memories during either Shemha fight, meaning that this was just a reanimated Carol with no other memories aside from pre-copied memories, of which we don't even know if she got all of Carol's memories, considering that we only know that Carol's maximum at the end of GX is likely what she copied, which was basically nothing when she fused with Elf 9 at the end of the arc, as she didn't even remember her name, and Elf 9 using Beatrice was just copying memories she had of Carol. While this all does seem like wank, Carol's scaling is pretty in-depth with the way and different avenues that just aren't talked about, but with every single statement implying that she's the only one to be able to rival God even on the guides themselves, it's pretty easy to see why this is the case. Now, I'm going to dedicate this section of the video to something I've been seeing multiple times while scaling Symphogear, and that's the different interpretations. You see, as you all know, I'm a person who tries to, at the very least, dive into every different interpretation of power scaling for a series. Then, while I come to my own conclusions, I also allow you all to come to your own conclusions as well. This way, this gives not only me a chance to see any arguments that haven't been brought up before, but also to try and gather evidence to whatever I believe is the correct belief to the scaling. Now obviously there is a correct and incorrect way to scale certain series, but the Mahou Shoujo genre leaves a lot in the air a lot of the time. And specifically with Carol, I've seen a significant amount of different interpretations, but the ones I want to talk about are the ones that lead to her being on the lower end of the scaling. Because when I see Carol scaled, she either falls within two sections, the planetary interpretation and the close to universal or confirmed universal interpretation. Now while I went over a scaling that is closer to the latter for the most part, I do want to go over the first interpretation, because while I can see why it's thought of to be that way, there's a few things that are blatantly being misconstrued when it comes to the information provided. So I'll do a little debunk on the main points I want to go over for that argument, mainly appearing chronologically from GX to XV. But, like I said, you are still free to believe that interpretation if you want, and if there are any other arguments that you can bring up, then sure, go ahead. The first point would be the Ogawa statement, and this is the one where I actually agree with them on it. The entire argument is that just because Ogawa compared Carol's energy to a miniature sun doesn't mean that it automatically is a miniature sun, since Ogawa is just a dude and pretty much anyone in the room has more insight on how strong Carol would be based on them actually seeing these stats on a screen. However, just because I agree that that specific Ogawa statement isn't the most reputable source, it does not mean that I believe that Carol isn't small star level. It just means that you have to find other resources for that line of thinking, something that we do have in the following arc of AXZ. On top of that, the multipliers themselves do translate as well, as using the X-Drive multipliers of 14 to 35 billion times on top of whatever the gear users were previously, as they surpassed their fight with the Nephilim that would have burned up the entire planet just by being near it, all in base. In addition, this isn't even adding the Ignite multipliers of 10 times per level either, so the numbers themselves do add on to this. Following this, the second thing is actually linked to the first example of showing additional feats for Carol's small star scaling, with that being the alkaloids with the pocket dimension. Now with this argument, a lot of people end up having a lot of issues with this thing in particular, because the scaling just jumps drastically without any real reason. The main argument that they use is that they say that these special type alkaloids isn't actually creating everything within that pocket dimension, including the stars or the planets, using the Chateau de Taffage as an example that the alchemists can use illusions rather than these things actually being created. However, there are a few issues with this argument, and all of this does stem from the Chateau de Taffage. For example, they acknowledge that the people the FIS trio fight are all illusions, but these illusions are still tangible and can use their moves, so it's not like they're fighting in their mind against air. These are tangible things. On top of that, there's also some thought that they can't actually make pocket dimensions, despite the fact that the Chateau de Taffage was laying literally anywhere else and broke out of the skies before the big fight in GX. There is also the argument that they can make pocket dimensions or subspace cages as Elf9 and Genjiro state, but that there are walls and it takes up a specific space, since the gears never leave from where they are transported from, since it doesn't make sense for such a large area to be generated just by a simple noise. However, Noble Red is able to use Daedalus N, creating a labyrinth whose internal size is the same distance between the Earth and the Moon, something that's also confirmed in the keywords. So it's obvious that multiple characters can manipulate pocket dimensions or warp space for it to be larger than it actually appears. So it's consistent that the alkaloids can make these tangible things, and pocket dimensions really aren't that implausible to believe. Now, the real reason they don't believe this is because it doesn't make sense that the gears would be able to jump such a level in base when they needed X-Drive for Carol in the previous arc, but in reality this is just because the gears get their own equivalent of Zenkais each arc. While that sounds blatantly untrue, the fact that these gears get upgrades every arc, and these are also basically confirmed by multiple characters throughout the series, only confirms that they will be above whatever their X-Drive was in the prior arc. On top of that, this is also the same arc where everyone learns Unison to fight in base, which is around a Negretto Ignite level increase, so it makes sense for them to beat these special alkaloids all in base. The final one is the one that's the most contentious within the entire fandom, being the feat regarding Adam bringing the divine energy from the stars. Now, the reason this one is the most contentious is because no one agrees if Adam himself grabbed the energy from the stars or not. Despite the keywords confirming that he did, it was more so that he forced open God's gate to collect that energy, which makes people believe otherwise. However, this is also another case of just because it doesn't look like he did, doesn't mean that he can't. The reason I say this is because even if Adam didn't take his hand, put it into a star, then put the ley lines on it directly, he still forced open God's gate, which is a power that can withhold all of that energy in the first place. Now, this doesn't scale him to the divine energy, which is the main reason why people are trying to disprove this feat, but it shows that he can interact with something that can hold the entire power of a constellation at once and can still fight afterwards. And this would all be Adam holding back by a considerable amount, since he apparently uses most of his energy to keep his looks. And even if you say that most was the bare minimum of 50%, since anything above 50% would be more than half, that means that half of his power can open God's Gate by himself and still be above Hibiki and Saint Germain. So it isn't improbable for Adam to not only be solar system level, especially after looking at the alkanoids argument we disproved earlier, but potentially be much higher, and the gears blatantly surpass it as stated with the rebuild keyword. As for any final thoughts regarding Carol's scaling, another thing to bring up about her is that throughout the entire story, there's this logic that she's been nerfed within each arc due to specific reasonings and factors. I think that this is what leads to Carol being thought of to be as strong as she is in the minds of those in the community, so I do want to go over this logic and provide my own input on it. Now, this is technically correct, since Carol was nerfed the entire time throughout the series, and we hear about this more than once. The first time we hear this is after Carol is reborn in a new body, as we're told and shown that Carol's body suffers rejections throughout the rest of GX, and she even gets sneaked a couple of times. Like from Shirobei cutting down the Yantra Sauvat, I can't say that word, to operate the Chateau de Tafage, and Chris nearly landing a devastating blow to her in base that Lumiere couldn't stop. In addition, she also does suffer rejections from the final fight against the Gears when she gets hit with Glorious Break, all before her alchemic beast detonates. Meanwhile, the second time is just the implication I went over earlier, with Carol being stated to not burn away any of Elf9's memories to fight against Shemha, despite us knowing that this is something that she had the ability to do. Now, going over this topic in general, I do want to say that even though she was nerfed, there isn't enough evidence to say that this nerf she had was insanely monumental in any of her major fights, as much as I even did go out of my way to hype it up. In order to show this, I want to briefly examine the only times they would have mattered, being in the fight at the end of GX and the Shemha fights. In the fight against Hibiki and the gear users, the only rejection that mattered was the final one before she got hit with Glorious Break, but at this point she had already decided to burn away the rest of the memory she had in order to clash with Hibiki in a final bout. However, the thing about this is that Carol even acknowledged that before the final rejection that the gear users were still one armed gear too short of actually hurting her, so the rejection didn't matter here. As for the other nerfs in the fights against Shemha, her actively limiting herself wouldn't have actually hindered her in the fight regardless. Now, despite me going over the fact that her power nearly struck down God previously, this was with Alkahest, the power that was cancelled out by the Shinshojing, which blocked off her alchemy. So even if she did use more power, it would have been stopped regardless. In addition, another thing that I initially thought of that others didn't think of was the alchemic beast, since that was something that she still should have access to, but one of the explanations someone provided was that she didn't have enough energy to actually use it, but that's a different problem, where the reality wasn't that she couldn't use it, but there was no reason to use it. After all, she was fighting against a character who could not only cancel out an ability that was intended to dissect her molecule by molecule, but also someone who could negate any physical damage unless they specifically fought with 6 other people with unison. So the alchemic beast was something that wasn't used because she was nerfed, but instead because there was no benefit to it. However, I will go on to say that this Carol at the end of XV in the Shemha fight is most likely the peak of Carol, even if she didn't go all out by the technical standard. The only other thing I wanted to bring attention to actually involves Carol's intelligence, since I believe that isn't something that's spoken about enough. Carol is as intelligent as she is strong, something that's basically confirmed all over the series, but no one really understands exactly how smart she is within the verse. Carol's knowledge spans over thousands of years and reincarnations, as she had the ability to build spare bodies with alchemy to transfer said memories after each death. But something that people tend to overlook is that Carol's intelligence is just off the charts. Even just going off of the final arc, Carol is able to find a way to condense a molecular reconstruction that she she originally needed the entire Chateau de Taufage for, a massive structure made entirely of relics, all over the course of a couple of days to fight against Shamha. Even while fighting against gods, she confirms that she already has knowledge over everything in the verse, even including how to fight against Shamha by way of 7-way unison despite the short time frame. This is also confirmed a bit more when Elf9 reveals that she has knowledge of how to set up Project Ignite within the Symphogears and knowledge on the Philosopher's Stone and AXZ, despite her only having enough memories to help build the Chateau de Taufage when she's first revealed to the cast, meaning that there's just the potential that Carol deemed the knowledge of the Philosopher's Stone, the apex of all alchemists, to be irrelevant enough to let Elf9 have that information. You could say that Elf9 learned about the Philosopher's Stone after the defeat of Carol, but it just wouldn't make sense considering the narrative behind the Philosopher's Stone in the first place. Despite this, Carol's intelligence is something that is also considerable to her strength, which somewhat makes sense considering that she's burning these memories to fight. Thanks for watching. I had too much fun making the Carol video, if you couldn't tell from how excited I was to talk about it. I had more fun talking about this than the actual Hibiki video. What? Carol is one of the coolest characters in the verse, so it was no wonder why I felt so excited to make a video about the Slaughterer of Miracles. That, and I had the voice line from XDU before it shut down, so that was also another factor, I guess. Not only that, but it's sort of the same as the other gear discussions where people don't really give it a second thought, but if you look deeper into it, it's certainly something that's thought-provoking when it comes to the overall scaling of the series. So it makes you think about each statement that may have been a stray statement or so that can be interpreted differently. Hence why I said before that this series has the most varied interpretations despite having the most concise scaling out of Mahou Shoujo. That being said, and rambling aside, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, or if you did not like this video, be sure to give the video a dislike and tell me about how I should outcast myself, and as always, ciao.
今ここで限界を超えろ。それしか道はねえ。俺たち金色の夜明け団だ。クローバー王国最強の魔法騎士団だ。Whoop, whoop.